Episode 4 Physiology, Brain Mapping, and Psychophysics. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the instruments, arguments, questionable methods, and surprisingly dramatic backstories that shaped psychology. Today we meet the physiologists, which means nerves, brains, thresholds, reaction times, frog legs, pigeons, electrical stimulation, skull bumps, and the beginning of psychology saying, "Excuse me, I can be a science too." In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. In earlier episodes, we saw the rise of mechanism, empiricism, positivism, and the problem of the human observer. Today, those ideas start moving into the body. Psychology is not yet fully independent, but it is getting closer, and the route there goes through physiology. Part 1. Physiology becomes experimental. Physiology became an experimentally oriented discipline in the 1830s, due largely to the German physiologist Johannes Müller. Müller advocated the use of the experimental method, which was crucial. This matters because psychology did not become scientific just by asking interesting questions. People had been asking interesting questions about the mind for thousands of years. What changed was method. Observation became more careful. Experimentation became more controlled. Measurement became more precise. And the body became something researchers could investigate systematically. One of Müller's major contributions was his theory of the specific energies of nerves. This theory suggested that the stimulation of particular nerves always leads to a characteristic sensation. In other words, each sensory nerve has its own specific energy. So the kind of sensation you experience depends not simply on the stimulus itself, but on the nerve that is stimulated. That is a subtle but important point. The nervous system is not just a passive wire carrying information. It shapes the kind of experience produced. Müller's theory influenced later research that aimed to localize functions within the nervous system and to identify sensory receptor mechanisms at the periphery of the organism. That means researchers increasingly wanted to know, where does sensation begin? Which nerves produce which experiences? How does stimulation become perception? Can functions be located in specific parts of the nervous system? Those questions become central to scientific psychology. Part 2. Mapping the brain before brain scans. Today, when we think of brain mapping, we may picture colorful fMRI images, brain scans, neural networks, and glowing regions of activation. But early brain mapping was much more direct. And by direct, I mean sometimes extremely direct. Researchers studied brain function by conducting research on brain tissue itself. Their goal was to determine which parts of the brain controlled different functions. That process is called mapping, identifying specific parts of the brain associated with specific cognitive, sensory, motor, or bodily functions. These early efforts did two important things. First, they helped define the brain as a specialized organ with different areas responsible for different functions. Second, they refined research methods that would become widespread in physiology and psychology. This is where the nervous system becomes one of psychology's most important entry points into science. Part 3. Marshall Hall and Reflex Behavior. One important figure in this story is Marshall Hall, who helped pioneer the study of reflex behavior. Hall observed that decapitated animals could still move when various nerve endings were stimulated. That observation mattered because it suggested that not all behavior required conscious intention. Movement could happen through the nervous system without the mind actively deciding to move. Hall concluded that different levels of behavior arise from different places in the brain and nervous system. He proposed that voluntary movement depended on the cerebrum. Reflex movement depended on the spinal cord. Involuntary movement could result from direct stimulation of the muscles. And respiratory movement depended on the medulla. This was important because it broke behavior into different kinds of movement and connected those movements to different parts of the nervous system. That is very psychological, because once researchers begin distinguishing voluntary behavior from reflexive behavior, conscious action from automatic movement, and brain-based control from spinal control, they are laying groundwork for future theories of behavior. Part 4. Pierre Flourens and the extirpation method. Another major figure was Pierre Flourens, a professor of natural history. Flourens systematically destroyed parts of the brain and spinal cord in pigeons and then observed the consequences. This method is called the extirpation method. The extirpation method involves removing or destroying a specific part of the brain and observing the resulting changes in behavior. By damaging one area and watching what function changed, researchers tried to infer what that brain area normally did. It is not gentle science, it is not modern ethical science, but historically, it played a major role in the attempt to map brain function. Florence concluded that the cerebrum controls higher mental processes. He argued that parts of the midbrain control visual and auditory reflexes. He identified the cerebellum as important for coordination, and he concluded that the medulla governs heartbeat, respiration, and other vital functions. Together, Hall and Florence helped establish the idea that different parts of the nervous system are associated with different forms of behavior. That helped move psychology closer to biology, physiology, and experimental method. Part 5. Broca and the clinical method. Another major method for studying brain function was the clinical method, associated with Paul Broca. The clinical method involves studying patients who show specific behavioral or cognitive deficits during life, and then examining their brains after death. So the logic is, a person has a particular difficulty while alive. After death, researchers examine the brain. If there is damage in a particular area, researchers infer that the damaged area may have been involved in the lost function. Broca is especially famous for his work on speech production. His method helped show that specific mental or behavioral functions could be linked to specific brain regions. This is another major step toward localization of function, and localization is central to the broader story of brain mapping. Part 6. Fritsch, Hitzig, and electrical stimulation. Then we have Gustav Fritsch and Eduard Hitzig, who developed the electrical stimulation method. This technique involved using weak electrical currents to explore the cerebral cortex. Fritsch and Hitzig found that stimulating certain cortical areas produced motor responses in animals such as rabbits and dogs. That was a huge discovery. It suggested that specific parts of the cerebral cortex were connected to specific motor functions. Again, we see the same pattern. Researchers are no longer talking about the brain as one mysterious, undifferentiated organ. They are identifying functions. They are mapping relationships. They are using controlled interventions. They are asking how specific physical processes produce specific behavioral outcomes. That is exactly the kind of thinking that helped psychology become experimental. Part 7. Franz Josef Gall and the brain. Now we arrive at one of the most famous and complicated figures in this episode, Franz Josef Gall. Gall dissected the brains of deceased animals and humans. In doing so, he confirmed several important anatomical facts. He identified the existence of both white matter and gray matter in the brain. He observed nerve fibers connecting each side of the brain to the opposite side of the spinal cord. He also identified fibers connecting the two halves of the brain. These contributions were important. Gall was not simply a historical punchline. He did serious anatomical work, but then he turned his attention from the inside of the brain to the outside of the skull, and that is where things get historically messy. Gall became interested in the relationship between the shape and size of the brain and mental characteristics. He observed that species with larger brains tended to display more intelligent behavior than species with smaller brains. From there, he developed a system he called cranioscopy, which later became known as phrenology. Phrenology proposed that the shape of a person's skull revealed their intellectual and emotional characteristics. Gall believed that if a mental characteristic was especially well developed, the corresponding area of the brain would be larger. That enlargement would supposedly create a protrusion or bulge on the skull. If the characteristic was weak, there would supposedly be an indentation. So, according to phrenology, you could read a person's mind, personality, and moral tendencies by feeling the bumps and dents on their head. Gall mapped the location of 35 human attributes, including traits such as conscientiousness, benevolence, and self-esteem. Scientifically, this was wrong. But historically, it was enormously influential. Part 8. Phrenology becomes popular. Phrenology became wildly popular, especially because of Johann Spurzheim, who did a great deal to popularize the movement. Spurzheim gave lectures and demonstrations that brought phrenology to public audiences, and people loved it. Millions of Americans had their heads examined. Phrenological societies were formed. The reading of skull bumps became so widespread that some American businesses used phrenology to select employees. Practitioners claimed they could use phrenology to assess a child's intelligence, guide educational decisions, and even counsel couples experiencing marital problems. This is one of the reasons phrenology succeeded in the United States. It promised practical application. It claimed to help with real-world problems. And Americans, with their pragmatic streak, were often attracted to methods that appeared useful. This practical appeal matters because it foreshadows later American psychology. American psychology would become strongly interested in application, education, work, testing, therapy, industry, law, and everyday life. Phrenology was wrong in its specific claims, but it tapped into something powerful. People wanted a science of individual differences. They wanted to measure character, they wanted to predict behavior, they wanted tools for practical decision-making. Psychology would eventually pursue those goals in more scientific ways. But phrenology got there early, loudly, and with skull charts. Part 9. The machine that read your head. Because phrenology was so popular, people even built machines to automate it. Charles Lavery and Frank White developed a machine that could read the bumps on people's heads. The machine printed a report giving scores on 32 mental attributes, ranging from self-esteem to combativeness, and it was a financial success. 33 machines were built and used profitably for several years. This is both funny and historically revealing, because the machine reflects the larger scientific culture of the time. Measurement had prestige, machines had authority, quantification looked scientific, a printed report felt objective. Even if the underlying theory was deeply flawed, the form of the procedure made it feel legitimate. And that is a lesson psychology still needs to remember. Not everything that produces a score is scientifically valid. Not every measurement is meaningful. A machine can make something look objective even when the theory underneath it is wrong. That is a very useful historical warning. Part 10. The rejection of phrenology. Phrenology eventually faced serious scientific criticism. Florence found that the shape of the skull does not match the contours of the underlying brain tissue. The brain is too soft to produce bumps and dents in the bony surface of the skull in the way Gall proposed. Florence and others also showed that the specific brain areas Gall assigned to particular mental functions were incorrect. So phrenology failed scientifically, but it still matters historically. It popularized the idea that mental functions might be localized in the brain. It encouraged interest in individual differences. It connected mind, brain, and measurement in the public imagination. And it showed how easily a flawed method can become popular when it offers practical answers. That is exactly why we study it. Not because it was right, because it was influential. Part 11. Why Germany became psychology's launchpad. Now let's move to Germany. Germany became the major launchpad for experimental psychology, and there are several reasons for that. First, the mechanistic spirit was especially pronounced in Germany. A group of scientists known as the Berlin Physical Society was committed to explaining all phenomena through the principles of physics whenever possible. They wanted to connect physiology with physics. They wanted to understand living organisms within the framework of mechanism. They argued that the only forces active within an organism were ordinary physicochemical forces. That brought together many of the themes we have already discussed: materialism, mechanism, empiricism, experimentation, measurement. This created a scientific environment where psychological questions could be studied with physical and physiological methods. Germany's intellectual history helped pave the way for an experimental science of psychology. Part 12. German universities and scientific culture. Germany was also especially well-suited to the kind of careful descriptive and classificatory work needed in biology, zoology, and physiology. German scientists emphasized the careful collection of observable facts. They often used an inductive approach, meaning they built general principles from detailed observations. Germany also defined science broadly. Science could include fields such as phonetics, linguistics, history, archaeology, aesthetics, logic, and literary criticism. That broad definition mattered because it made room for psychology. In some countries, scholars were more skeptical about whether the mind could be studied scientifically. But German universities were more open to using scientific tools to explore and measure many aspects of mental life. In the 19th century, educational reforms swept across Germany. Universities became devoted to academic freedom, which allowed scholars to pursue new areas of inquiry. That included psychology. German universities provided ideal environments for scientific research. There were laboratories, there were trained scientists, there were students, there were career paths, there was prestige attached to research. The chances of making a living as a research scientist or professor were higher in Germany than in many other places. The competition was intense, but the rewards were real. only the best succeeded in 19th century German science, and that environment helped produce major breakthroughs in psychology. Part 13, Helmholtz, the scientific multi-tool. Now we meet Hermann von Helmholtz. Helmholtz was a researcher in both physics and physiology, and his work was instrumental in the emergence of the new psychology. He is one of those historical figures who seems to have worked on everything: physics, physiology, vision, hearing, color blindness, human eye movements, glaciers, geometrical axioms, hay fever, wireless telegraphy, radio, casual. Helmholtz pushed for a mechanistic and deterministic approach. He believed the human sense organs function like machines. He even compared the nervous system to technical systems such as the telegraph. This was part of the broader mechanistic worldview. The body receives signals. Signals travel through nerves. Responses follow in time. The system can be measured. Helmholtz formulated the law of the conservation of energy using mathematics. He invented the ophthalmoscope, an instrument used to examine the interior of the eye. He also wrote the Handbook of Physiological Optics, a major work in vision science. His contributions were broad, but for psychology, one of his most important areas of research was the speed of the neural impulse. Part 14, Measuring the Speed of Thought's Machinery. Before Helmholtz, many scientists believed that nerve impulses were instantaneous. That is understandable. When you decide to move, movement feels immediate. When you touch something hot, your reaction feels immediate. But Helmholtz showed that nerve conduction takes time. He demonstrated this empirically by stimulating a motor nerve attached to a muscle in a frog's leg. Then he measured the delay between stimulation of the nerve and the muscle's response. He concluded that the speed of the neural impulse was about 90 feet per second. Now, the exact value was less important than the broader implication. Neural activity is measurable. Thought and movement do not collapse into one instantaneous event. There is a measurable interval between stimulation and response. Helmholtz also studied reaction times for sensory nerves in human subjects. He found enormous individual differences. This work helped inspire later reaction time experiments, and those experiments became central to early experimental psychology. Why? Because reaction time gave researchers a way to study mental processes indirectly. If a task takes longer under one condition than another, maybe the extra time reflects additional mental processing. That idea becomes incredibly important later. Cognitive psychology still uses versions of this logic. Helmholtz's work was one of the earliest examples of experimentation and measurement applied to a psychophysiological process. Part 15. Helmholtz and vision. Helmholtz also had a major impact on psychology through his research on vision. He studied the external muscles of the eye. He studied the mechanisms by which internal eye muscles focus the lens. He revised and extended Thomas Young's theory of color vision, which became known as the Young-Helmholtz theory of color vision. This theory proposed that color vision depends on different receptor systems sensitive to different wavelengths of light. Helmholtz also studied hearing, especially tone perception, harmony, discord, and resonance. He was interested not just in collecting data for its own sake, but in extending scientific knowledge to practical problems. He cared about the applied benefits of research. This is another theme that will become important in psychology. Basic science and application are not always separate. Understanding vision, hearing, and neural conduction can inform medicine, technology, education, and eventually psychology. Part 16. Weber and the Measurement of Difference. Next, we meet Ernst Weber. Weber made major contributions through his research on the physiology of the sense organs. He used physiological experimental methods to investigate problems that were psychological in nature. Earlier researchers had studied the sense organs, but Weber explored new areas, especially skin senses and muscular sensations. His most significant contribution was his experimental work on two-point discrimination. Two-point discrimination refers to the minimum distance between 2 points of stimulation required for a person to feel two distinct touches rather than one. In Weber's experiment, subjects were touched with 2 points on the skin while they could not see the apparatus. When the 2 points were very close together, people reported feeling only 1 point. As the distance increased, they became uncertain. Eventually, they reported feeling 2 distinct points of touch. That point is called the 2-point threshold. A threshold is the point at which a psychological effect begins to occur. This was a major concept. Weber showed that sensation could be measured, not just described, measured. That is a huge moment in the history of psychology. Part 17. The just noticeable difference. Weber also studied the just noticeable difference, often abbreviated as JND. The just noticeable difference is the smallest difference between two stimuli that can be detected. In one set of experiments, Weber asked subjects to lift two weights. One was a standard weight, the other was a comparison weight. Participants reported which one felt heavier. When the difference between the weights was small, participants judged them as the same. When the difference was larger, participants noticed the difference. Weber found that the just noticeable difference was not based on an absolute amount of difference. Instead, it depended on a constant ratio. For lifted weights, the just noticeable difference was approximately 1/40 of the standard weight. So if the standard weight is larger, the amount of change needed to notice the difference must also be larger. This is important because it shows that perception is relative. We do not simply perceive physical differences directly and absolutely. We perceive differences in relation to the starting level of stimulation. Part 18, Muscle Sense and Relative Difference. Weber then asked how muscular sensations contribute to weight discrimination. He found that subjects were more accurate when they lifted the weights themselves than when the experimenter placed the weights in their hands. Why? When subjects lifted the weights, they used both tactile sensations and muscular sensations. When the experimenters simply placed the weights in their palms, they relied mainly on tactile sensations. Weber concluded that internal muscular sensations influence the ability to discriminate between weights. This again shows that perception is not simply a copy of the external stimulus. The body contributes to the experience. The muscles matter. Movement matters. The organism's own activity matters. Weber also conducted visual discrimination experiments and found different ratios for different senses. This led him to propose that for each human sense, there is a constant ratio for the just noticeable difference between two stimuli. This research suggested that there is not a direct one-to-one correspondence between a physical stimulus and our perception of it. That is exactly the kind of issue psychology needed to study. Part 19. Weber's Importance for Psychology. Like Helmholtz, Weber saw himself mainly as studying physiological processes, but his work provided a method for investigating the relationship between body and mind. That relationship can be framed as the difference between the physical stimulus and the resulting sensation. A stimulus exists in the physical world. A sensation occurs in experience. The relationship between them is not always simple or direct. Weber's work gave scientists a way to measure that relationship. It also showed that experimental methods could be useful for studying psychological phenomena. That is why Weber matters so much. He helped make sensation measurable. And if sensation can be measured, then maybe mental life can be studied scientifically. Part 20. Fechner and the Math of Mind. Now we come to Gustav Theodor Fechner. Fechner is one of the most important figures in this episode because he helped establish psychophysics, the study of the relationship between physical stimuli and mental experience. Fechner had a complicated intellectual personality. He had both a mechanical side and a humanistic side. He was trained in science and medicine, but he was also interested in metaphysics. He rejected the purely mechanistic scientific training he had received in medical school. He believed that the universe could be understood from the standpoint of consciousness. That belief contradicted the dominant materialistic view that the universe and consciousness consisted only of inert matter. Fechner later became seriously ill with a condition described as similar to neurosis. While lying in bed one morning, he had a flash of insight about the connection between mind and body. He believed that a quantitative relationship could be found between a mental sensation and a material stimulus. That idea was revolutionary, because if the relationship between stimulus and sensation could be measured, then the mental and physical worlds could be connected mathematically. Part 21. Fechner's Insight. Fechner believed that increasing the intensity of a stimulus does not produce a one-to-one increase in the intensity of the sensation. For example, adding a small amount of light in a dark room may be very noticeable, but adding that same amount of light in an already bright room may barely be noticed. The effect of a stimulus depends on the amount of stimulation already present. Fechner proposed that stimulus intensity follows a geometric series, while sensation follows an arithmetic series. That sounds technical, but the basic idea is this. Physical stimulation and subjective sensation increase at different rates. Sensation depends on stimulation, but not in a simple one-to-one way. Fechner argued that the amount of sensation, a mental quality, depends on the amount of stimulation, a physical quality. To measure changes in sensation, we need to measure changes in stimulation. This made it possible to formulate a quantitative relationship between the mental and material worlds. In other words, Fechner made it possible to conduct experiments on the mind. That is a massive development. Part 22. Absolute and differential thresholds. Fechner proposed ways to measure sensations. One approach involved determining whether a stimulus is present or absent. The absolute threshold is the point of intensity below which no sensation is reported, and above which a person does experience a sensation. In simpler terms, it is the smallest amount of stimulation needed for a person to detect something. But Fechner realized that the absolute threshold only gives us one value. It tells us where sensation begins, but it does not describe the full relationship between stimulus intensity and sensation. So he also focused on the differential threshold. The differential threshold is the smallest amount of change in a stimulus that produces a change in sensation. This connects directly to Weber's just noticeable difference. Fechner believed that for each human sense, there is a certain relative increase in stimulus intensity that produces an observable change in sensation. If that is true, then sensation and stimulus can both be measured. Their relationship can be stated mathematically. Fechner expressed this relationship as S a log r. Here, sensation is related to the logarithm of stimulus intensity. Eventually, Fechner recognized that his principle was essentially what Weber had already demonstrated. That is why this is often called the Weber-Fechner law. Part 23. Psychophysics and Measurement Methods. Fechner's work on psychophysics focused on the relationship between the mental and the material. He developed one of the three fundamental methods used in psychophysics and systematized the other two. One important method is the method of average error, also called the method of adjustment. In this method, subjects adjust a variable stimulus until they perceive it as equal to a constant stimulus. For example, a person might adjust the brightness of one light until it appears equal to another. This technique can be used in research on reaction times, visual discriminations, and auditory discriminations. Fechner also distinguished between inner psychophysics and outer psychophysics. Outer psychophysics concerns the relationship between external stimulus and sensation. Inner psychophysics concerns the relationship between sensation and brain or nerve excitation. That distinction matters because Fechner was not only interested in the external stimulus and the subjective experience, he also wanted to understand the bodily processes linking them. Wrap up. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Muller matters. Hall matters. Flourens matters. Broca matters. Fritsch and Hitzig matter. Gall matters, even when he is wrong. Helmholtz matters. Weber matters. Fechner matters. But the pattern matters more. Each figure is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. If philosophers asked where knowledge comes from, physiologists asked how the body receives it. If mechanism described the universe as lawful, physiology asked whether the nervous system was lawful too. If empiricism emphasized experience, psychophysics asked how experience could be measured. And if psychology wanted to become a science, it needed methods precise enough to study sensation, perception, and response. That is today's stop on the timeline. Keep the evidence close, keep the assumptions visible, and I'll meet you in the next chapter of Psychology's story. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own, Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own, Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources.